All right, Numbers 30, let's call this one yes and no. Not so much for the ways in which those terms might come up in this chapter, but for the way that they definitely come up in Jesus' advice to us to simply let our yes be yes and our no be no, advising that anything more than that really comes from sin, in the way that we can be tempted to make promises that are too big or vows that we just can't keep. We talked about this before, and it really goes back to Leviticus at the end of the book, where it seems like there may be this kind of odd chapter that doesn't so much fit in a neat, tidy outline of what Leviticus is talking about, where it's talking about some of these same things, being careful of vows. The difference here in Numbers is that it's talking about some caveats for vows rashly uttered. So for a head of household, there isn't much wiggle room. If you vow something, you got to pay it. And he's saying that God is telling us that you got to pay it in full under the Mosaic law. But he's saying if there's a situation in a marriage or a daughter in a father's house, if she makes a rash vow, her father can get her out of it. Likewise, a woman who's married, her husband can get her out of those vows in certain situations. But other than those, you're simply bearing iniquity for breaking your word. And that is a very serious thing that we'll see come up, as we said again, in the nation of Israel, because they're essentially going to have a civil war that extends from them sticking themselves to a vow early on in the conquest of the promised land, a vow they make to the Gibeonites, who are very clever in the way they choose not to fight the Israelites, but to bait them into making a promise or a vow. And so likewise, to this day, I just got to hear a man speak on this chapter this week, really just this morning, talking about the severity of vows and how even as New Testament Christians, we still need to be careful to take Jesus' advice to simply let our yes be our yes and our no be our no, so that we don't get ourselves into trouble. And that is exactly what this chapter is getting at. We need to be very careful and understand, if we are speaking in the language of promises and vows, there's a reason that there are whole areas of the law that are devoted to reasonably making agreements about what should be said and what should not be said, and making sure that we think through the implications of the promises that we make. But when we're in the moment, we don't always do that. And so we need mercy. And that's one of the reasons why this chapter is so important, because it reminds us that even though Leviticus talked about the severity of vows and the need to fulfill all that you promise, there is mercy that we see here in Numbers, and God willing, even more so moving forward into the new covenant, understanding that James says, look, if anybody can tame the tongue, they're a perfect person. And like we've said before, if you can do it, hats off to you. But the rest of us need mercy and help. Why? Because in the course of trying to help people, it's one thing if we're just being shady, but in the course of trying to help people, sometimes we say too much without thinking it through fully. And so remember, if you can simply impress upon your mind that this is an area, vows and promises, that lawyers make a lot of money to sort through because people get in a lot of trouble saying too much, then it'll help you understand the severity with which the scriptures are likewise trying to get us to pause and think before we speak, definitely before we make promises, and more so before we make vows. Because like we said, the implications can be hard to think through. It's one of the reasons why it's important to get wise counsel from people who are trying to help us understand the natural consequences of the things that we speak and promise. So as we say, his best to you as you go forward with him, God willing, speaking and promising wisely, if you got to promise it all.